Hello everyone, and I have a short presentation really just giving an overview of what the legal and regulatory challenges may be in the application of high pressure temperature processing to foods, and I'm based at the Teagasc Food Research Centre in Dublin. So in terms of the challenges that may be incurred in terms of actually applying the technology, we reviewed what is the legal framework in Europe in terms of implementing new technologies like this, what is the likely views and approaches of the member state competent authorities from some discussions with them, and what's the role of the food business operator themselves if they want to implement the technology in terms of the type of data and stuff like that to support the choice of the selected HPT treatment, pressure, time, temperature combinations, etc., and implementing it into their HACCP plan. What's the critical things in relation to things like the critical control points, monitoring of the process, and validation. So in talking to some of the member state competent authorities, it was quite clear that there was very little knowledge of the high pressure temperature technology. It's obviously very new, but obviously there is already use of HPP. So in having some of the discussions, what I was going to present is some of the issues in relation to both high pressure processing as well as HPT, which would presumably be considered to be an extension of the HPP. So just to remind you that HPP is where the pressure is likely in the range of 300 to 600 megapascals at ambient temperature. It's currently employed to extend shelf life, improves food safety by an activation of bacterial pathogens, vegetative ones, or to enhance food organoleptic qualities and quality parameters. However, as we heard earlier, spores, like particularly things like Clostridia and Bacillus, which may cause problems, are not inactivated by HPP on its own. So as we've been hearing this morning, the HPT process, where the likely pressures are up to 600 megapascals at temperatures of somewhere between 90 to 121 over short holding periods. So both these, as we've heard, contribute to the process's microbial lethality and can give significant reduction in spores of concern to food safety and spoilage. So has the potential for application to foods, including low acid ones, to give long shelf life at chilled temperatures or indeed shelf stable foods. So in terms of the equipment, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in the next presentation, but it's very likely if it was going to be implemented that either the equipment would be in situ in the food company itself, or perhaps, as is with the case with HPP, that it may be present in what's called a tolling service facility, where the companies can bring their food samples for batch treatment at the facility, and both scenarios were looked at in terms of potential applications. So in the EU, foods which are produced using new technologies or production processes must be first considered under what's called the Novel Foods Legislation 25/2283, and it specifies that a food should be considered as novel where it results from a production process or technology not used for food production in the EU before May 1997, or which gives rise to a significant change in composition or structure of the food, affecting its nutritional value, metabolism, or level of undesirable substances. So a bit of a lengthy statement there. It states that emergent technologies must be looked at in terms of the impact that they might have on food, particularly on its safety, but it also does support them and states that new technologies and innovations in food production should be encouraged as they may have a benefit in terms of environmental impact, food security, and bring a benefit to the consumer, as long as a high level of consumer protection is ensured. So HPP is considered in the EU as a novel technology and has been approved in the EU, but only specifically for fruit-based preparations in 2001. However, it is, as you're aware, being applied to a range of other foods, but without any specific need for a new application under novel foods. So basically it's been looked at by a number of institutes in different member states, and no specific issues in relation to its application to foods other than fruit-based preparations have been raised. And as I say, it's currently used in many countries, particularly here in Spain, for a range of food products. So the situation is that food business operators must consult with the member state competent authority when they first intend to use a novel process such as HPT and provide the necessary information to the competent authority to enable them to determine whether the food falls under the novel regulation. And it's the member state in each place where the food will be placed on the market for the first time will decide whether it's needing a new application under novel foods, or whether they consider that it's close enough to existing technologies that it doesn't need a new application. So a novel food process in the EU list should comply with the following. First of all, it shouldn't, on the basis of the scientific evidence, pose a safety risk to human health. Its intended use shouldn't mislead the consumer, especially if it's intended to replace another food and there's significant change in the nutritional value. And equally, if it's going to replace another food, it should not differ that food in such a way that normal consumption would be nutritionally disadvantaged. So it highlights that also that novel foods are subject to the EU general labelling requirements, provision of information to the consumer that they are sufficiently informed about the nature and safety of any novel food, particularly with regard to vulnerable groups. If foods are treated with HPT are supplied onwards in the chain, along the chain the information should be supplied that the foods have been treated with HPP or presumably HPT, and they should be considered within the HACCP plan. And a question that was raised in discussions with competent authorities is how would HPT products be labelled, so it's something possibly for discussion. In making the decision, the competent authority to look at the application of HPT and whether a new application would be needed, some of the things that they are likely to take into consideration is primarily that on the basis of scientific evidence that it doesn't pose a safety risk to human health. So they will be very much focused on, as I say, the safety, and particularly in low acid foods where Clostridium botulinum may pose a risk, that it is inactivated, and evidence for how this has been validated. Other issues of concern may be around how it's included in their HACCP plan, around the labelling of the product, and traceability issues. And evidence that the technology does not cause significant changes in the composition or structure of the food or food ingredient, which might affect nutritional value or create any undesirable substances. So if they're not happy with the evidence that's there and they feel that it must be referred upwards, it would then go to the EU Commission, who manage the all novel food applications, and they may refer it to EFSA for a scientific risk assessment, and ultimately it's the Commission then that adds the novel food or the novel process to the list. To support really the applicant in terms of proposing novel foods, there is no release of the data to support that for 5 years, so that the food company who proposed it has competitive advantage. And there have been many applications around novel foods, and around 90 authorised to date, with including a number of novel food technologies. So what's the role really of the food business operator then, if you want to go ahead and introduce this? Well, the first thing is to talk to your own member state competent authority where you first intend to propose it for sale. It must provide documentation to the competent authority around the safety of the process to enable them to make the decision whether it needs a new application. And they must document and implement procedures based on the principles of HACCP, covering the use of HPT for products as part of their food safety management systems. One of the key things to document will be how the chosen parameters of temperature, pressure and holding time were selected and validated to ensure the food safety of the treated product during a defined product shelf life. And the validation study should reflectively, accurately reflect the processes and conditions under which the product is produced and stored. And if shelf life studies are being carried out, it was raised by the competent authorities that food businesses should use accredited microbiological laboratories to support any microbiological testing in this area. They did highlight also around the whole HPT area that many chambers have different sizes, which may lead to different times for pressure and temperature to ramp up to reach the desired treatment pressure. Obviously, if you have a very small 1 litre vessel where many research studies are done, the ramp up time would be a lot faster than a large 50 litre vessel, which may impact on the D or the Z values for your treatment conditions. And indeed also, as we heard earlier, research in this study also showed that there was considerable inactivation of spores during temperature and pressure come-up times. So lethality in the come-up time is an important factor that should be taken into consideration when selecting the high pressure temperature process. The current view in talking to the competent authorities is that because the variability around D and Z values based on different machines, food matrices, they suggest that there's still a case-by-case assessment and validation of each newly requested use of HPP on its own merit, and that validation studies should be carried out under conditions as close as possible to that which would be used commercially. However, obviously the data that's produced in the project like this in terms of the process windows should greatly facilitate that process and reduce the amount of work that we've done in terms of the validation need, because there's obviously already very clear direction from this study around what types of treatment processes will be needed. So it needs to be incorporated into the HACCP, and you're all well familiar with the 7 steps. Obviously at the start of the process we'll be looking at the particular food itself, its composition, its pH, the conditions of storage, the temperature that it's going to be stored at, and obviously it's probably going to be stored under a vac pack in terms of these types of treatments, and what's the expected shelf life that's been desired, because these will all obviously impact on what is the process treatment that will be needed to give the target reduction. And then in terms of monitoring, it will be how will the treatment parameters be monitored to ensure they've reached the right levels. So the approach in industry is normally construct a flow diagram of the process, look at it on site, listing of the particular hazards and looking at the critical control points. So this will be a typical flow diagram for the HPT, with the food packed going through into the chamber, pressure come up time, treatment, pressure release, and then unloading. That's an example of what you'll see later on today. So in terms of the critical control points, it's setting up the target time, temperature, pressure to be reached for the desired level of food safety and stability. Very important that those parameters are measured, and within the machines, as you'll hear later, there are things like pressure sensors, temperature sensors, etc. to monitor these. And the HPT process needs to be validated, and particularly important in these chambers is that to identify if there's any particular cold spots, and to validate that the cold spots have sufficient time, temperature combination treatments. The last couple of slides is just around the use of the tolling facilities, if they're used rather than having the facility on site. And obviously it can be very advantageous in that the company doesn't incur the cost of having to install the equipment themselves, but they can avail of it. If using a tolling facility, the establishment should be registered as a food business with the relevant competent authority, and should fully understand that it's a food production facility and not just an equipment supplier. The food business operator using the tolling facility is still responsible for the safety of its food, and it should be part of their HACCP plan. And the food business operator, although they're contracting it out to the tolling company, should be fully involved in the design of the treatment parameters and monitoring and validation of the treatments, and ensuring that all relevant food safety systems are in place while the product is outside their control. Particularly concerns raised about maintaining the chain of traceability while the food is outside the control of the company, and things like labelling that often this is the very final step in the process before it's sent out for distribution, to make sure that there isn't stuff like damage to labels, so that traceability and stuff like that isn't impacted. So in conclusion, HPT offers the food industry, as we've heard today, great potential as an emerging technology to give safe food with a long shelf life in much shorter processing times than terminal alone. And the research from the project, which defines process windows for relevant spores, will support discussions of FPOs with their relevant regulators and competent authorities re the implementation of the technology. So thank you very much.